Let's go. You ready?
I'm ready.
I'm going to turn it on.
All right.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get going here in a minute. And thank you so much for being here today. Simon Rosenberg here. We're going to be here on our Zoom channel, but also live on YouTube for anyone who's watching on YouTube today. Thank you for joining us. We'll get going in just about a minute. So, and Amir, I have meetings afterwards. So I'm wearing a suit, which I don't often do in these.
For an Israeli to wear a suit is a special occasion, so it shows you that this is an important briefing.
I know we're becoming more Israeli here in that regard.
Yeah,
I do most of my events with a polo shirt, and it's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, the COVID times did change that. I noticed because I was in Washington at the time, and I remember the sudden shift from suits all the time to people joining on Zoom with their pajamas.
I know. Thank God in this warm city.
Oh, yeah.
So let's get going. I'm going to convene here, and I know that we'll have more people joining us, but
Great.
hey, welcome everybody. This is Simon Rosenberg from Substack Hopium Chronicles. Really grateful that you're all joining us here today. Got a special event. I think many of us have been deeply moved by the protests and the civic action that we've seen taking place in Israel. It was unexpected, and it's been robust and ongoing now for some time. And I know that in conversations I've had here in the US, so many people took inspiration, in what we were seeing in Israel. And I really felt it would be good to get a report from Israel about what's happened, what we can learn, what we think may happen next. And my friend Amir reached out to me and said, hey, I'd love to talk to your community if you get a moment. And so joining us today live, and for those of you who are watching recorded later, is Amir Tibon, who's a prominent journalist in Israel for the leading newspaper in Israel, Haaretz, and really grateful that he's taking the time to be with us. And Amir, why don't you just tell us, how did we get here? We've seen the images of the incredible outpouring of people on the streets in city after city in Israel. How did we get here? Start with sort of a little bit of a history lesson, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I think it's important to understand a little bit of the history to get to the moment today. We're not going to start in 1948 or even in 1967, but I will say a few months ago, almost half a year by now, we had an election here in Israel, and it was the 5th election in 4 years, part of an ongoing political crisis in the country that all stems from one place, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial and his attempts to reach a parliamentary majority that would allow him to cancel that trial or basically try to make it go away in various ways. And after 4 deadlocked elections and a short-lived government without Netanyahu, he made a comeback. The group of parties, our election system is wildly different than yours. I'm not going to go into all the details, but you have a 2-party system. We have a coalition system where usually several parties need to join in order to form a government. And after 4 deadlocked elections, in the 5th one in November, just a week before you had your midterms, in fact, the group of parties that support Netanyahu, it's his Likud party, which is more nationalist right-wing, and all of Israel's religious parties reached a majority. That majority, by the way, reflected more the nature of the system in Israel than an actual majority in the public. They won less than 50% of the vote, but because of bad arrangements within the center-left, a lot of votes were wasted, and that gave Netanyahu a majority. If that sounds familiar to some people watching us who were in the US in November 2016, it's an interesting comparison. And this government that he then formed, the most right-wing, most religious government in Israeli history, came in with a sweeping agenda. And the most important aspect of it is legislation to change the balance of power between the authorities in Israel. Legislation that would significantly weaken the Israeli judicial system, the courts, and also the prosecution and the government's legal advisors, and give almost unlimited power, really, to the government. It's important to note here that the system of checks and balances in Israel is much, much weaker than what you guys have in America. We don't have a written constitution. We don't have two houses of Congress. We just have one parliament, our Knesset. And that parliament is actually controlled in a way by the government, because the government always has the majority in the Knesset and it can control all the votes. And so the separation of powers is weak in Israel. And the most important authority that can limit the powers of the government in Israel is our Supreme Court. And what the government wants to do now with this legislation is take away that ability from the Supreme Court and make it subordinate in a way to the will of the government. A lot of people in Israel, most of them from the center left, more liberal forces in Israel, but also some moderate people on the right. And again, if that reminds you of certain coalitions that are being built in American politics, perhaps that's not a coincidence either. But a lot of people feel that this is a direct threat to Israel's very existence as a Jewish and democratic state. And the backlash to it has been incredible. These are the protests that you've been seeing in the streets for the last 17 weeks now, a very, very long time for hundreds of thousands of people to go out to the streets at least once a week, and on some weeks twice, in all parts of the country and demonstrate against this. So far, this protest movement have had one important achievement, which is that it led Netanyahu to announce a delay in the legislation to weaken the judicial system. It was supposed to go out for a vote exactly 1 month ago. On March 27 was supposed to be a crucial vote in our Knesset. And the night before that happened, Netanyahu made a terrible mistake, and he fired his own defense minister for daring to speak out against the legislation and warned that it was tearing apart Israeli society. The reaction to that was incredible and inspiring. 3 hours, even I would say 2 hours in some places in the country, after he announced his intention to fire the defense minister, hundreds of thousands of people left everything, left their homes, left their children sleeping in bed, and went out to protest in the street. It was a spontaneous demonstration of 500,000 people in different parts of the country. The next morning, Netanyahu delayed the legislation, and he said, we'll put a pause for about a month. That month is now over, and we may be again reaching the money time. And there is growing pressure on Netanyahu now also from the other side, from the religious right-wing forces in Israel to renew the legislation. Today, parties within his government organized a counter-demonstration in Jerusalem, where they are calling on him to renew the legislation. And they have also been successful. They have attracted, I think, more than 100,000 people to Jerusalem. I wouldn't even be surprised if it would be 200,000. There is energy in the streets of the country right now. There's a real battle. To borrow the words of President Joe Biden, a battle for the soul of the nation is what we're seeing here right now.
And what can you explain to us, what's the justification that Netanyahu is using to advance this? I mean, what is the explanation? What's the story he's telling about why this is necessary?
I will use here a line that I think was first actually written in The Economist when they had an editorial a few weeks ago against this legislation, and they said something that I personally agree with. They said this legislation is a terrible solution to a real problem. In Israel, like in other democracies, there are debates about the role and the powers of the court and the balance that should be between the different authorities. And I don't think the Israeli Supreme Court is, a sacred institution that is beyond criticism. Actually, if you look at some of the leaders of the opposition in Israel, who are today fighting the government's plan, some of them in the past have actually suggested their own versions of judicial reform, of all kinds of actions by the government that would, redraw some of the balance between the authorities. The problem really is that what the government is offering is extreme. And instead of addressing some of the real problems that exist in the judicial system in Israel, like, for example, a huge backlog for judges that makes court cases, go on forever and ever, or a lack of representation for certain segments of the population in the Supreme Court. There's only one Arab justice. There are historically only a few justices who come from the Sephardic or Mizrahi population, as we call in Israel, people who immigrated to the country from Arab and Muslim countries. There are real issues to address, but this legislation cynically and dangerously, instead of dealing with those problems, basically offers to redraw the lines that the government would have absolute power and the courts would be helpless to limit the actions of the government. And in a reality where the government also controls the legislator, you get something that can no longer be called a democracy. And so while there is, I think, a case for all kinds of legislation and action regarding the legal system, it has to be much more moderate and reasonable. And a lot of people get that. If you go to the demonstrations every weekend in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and in other cities, and you talk to people, and, you know, as a journalist writing about this, I've spoken to a lot of people who've taken part in these demonstrations. You hear people say, I'm not necessarily against any kind of change, but what they are offering is extreme and dangerous. And again, this is something that I think you've also seen in the past in American politics, where demagogues come and identify real problems, but offer fake solutions that don't actually solve the problem, but rather serve their own interests.
And talk about the people who are coming out. How would you characterize, I mean, it's obviously a huge percentage of the population at this point, right? You're a small country. I mean, talk about that. I mean, how many people live in Israel? How many people have been on the streets? What's the percentage that we're seeing? And talk a little bit about who's coming out. Young people, old people, everybody. I mean, how do we understand it from your eyes?
So in a country of just under 10 million people, you know, the largest demonstrations we've had, I think, were after the defense minister was fired last month, when you saw 500,000 people. And what was so impressive, again, that it was not a pre-planned demonstration. It was a spontaneous response to a sense of crisis. But if you look back to, you know, how this protest movement emerged, it started a few weeks after the government first announced this judicial plan. And the first demonstration in Tel Aviv, I would say it was maybe 10 to 20,000 people. And that was more like the, you know, hard base of the demonstrations. Although I have to say, I have neighbors here where I live. I live in a small community about an hour south of Tel Aviv, actually close to Israel's border with Gaza. And I had neighbors who had never before participated in demonstrations against the government, and are more like, you know, centrist in their political orientation. And they went to that first demonstration in Tel Aviv almost now 3 months ago. And every week it grew because more and more people became educated about the nature of this legislation and what it would mean and how it would limit their own rights. Because we understand that today in Israel, the Supreme Court plays a very important role in protecting people's rights. A lot of the progress that Israel has made in recent decades, and that we Israelis usually take pride in, including Netanyahu, by the way, right? When he speaks on CNN or Face the Nation or Meet the Press, he talks about Israel being the most gay-friendly country in the Middle East, and it's so advanced on women's rights and equality for minorities. And a lot of that progress was not reached, unfortunately, through legislation, but through landmark decisions of the Supreme Court. And so it's obvious that the more right-wing religious forces in Israel want to weaken the power of the court and politicize the court to a place where they can basically have that obstacle of a more liberal-leaning court that protects people's rights removed from their way. And so when more and more people realize that this is what is at stake here, this is not some technical legislation, it's not some moderate change between the authorities, but it's an attempt to completely redraw the lines, you started seeing the numbers go up and up. And it's a very diverse coalition, if you will, of protesters. You have young people and you know, students and people in the Tel Aviv area, but you have also a lot of older people, many of them reservists in the military, people who served in combat units, Air Force pilots who have risked their life for Israel, and many of them will still do it if they are called tomorrow morning. And they say, we signed a contract to defend a democratic country, not a dictatorship. And not half a democracy either. We signed a contract to defend a Jewish and democratic state. And they've been a leading voice in the demonstrations, very influential. and I think really have caused a lot of headaches for the government, because a lot of people in Israel have this sympathy and appreciation for people who take part in the military and do reserve duty. And one other factor I want to mention, which is very rare, the high-tech industry, which is the most important economic force in Israel, and really the driving force behind Israel's startup nation miracle and the economic boom of the last decades, has also joined this protest movement. And that's something we have never seen before. The high-tech industry in Israel was always known to be apolitical, focused on making money and having good business, which makes sense. And suddenly you saw the high-tech companies going on strike and sending their workers, encouraging them to take part in the demonstrations, because they understand that if Israel becomes a less liberal country and society, the high-tech industry is so flexible. These are very talented people. They have good English usually. There is great demand all over the world for their abilities. And this industry will not survive if Israel becomes a less open and liberal society. And so that's really big. And one last sentence I want to say, Simon, there's also two small contingencies, but very important, that have also been joining the demonstration. One of them is Arab citizens of Israel. This has actually been, I think, a failure of the protest movement. We are not seeing enough of them join. 20% of the country are Arab citizens. They will pay a huge price if this judicial legislation passes, because the court also has an important role in protecting minorities. But so far, not enough of them have joined. There hasn't been, I think, enough of a dialogue to make them feel part of the movement, and I hope that will improve. And the second group are religious, moderate Israelis, some of them more right-wing, others, there is also a religious left in Israel, small but very interesting to follow politically. And they have also been a very important force in this movement. And the more that they will join, I think it will have a greater impact as well.
And what's happened since you've had some holidays and some time off? Bibi said, let's wait a month. We're now on the other side of that. Yeah. Have the protests continued? Is the same kind of energy that we saw beforehand continuing now? And where are we today?
I think there was definitely some kind of a drop after the legislation was put on hold. There was, in a way, a climax that led to that confrontation on the night he fired the defense minister. And the reason he fired the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who is a member of his own party, the Likud, and supportive of the more hawkish positions that the party has, he fired him because the defense minister came out and said, listen, this legislation will tear apart the society and the military. And there has been great concern within the high ranks of the military that reservists will no longer show up for duty in the special forces, in the Air Force. Hundreds of pilots have said that they would reconsider showing up if this were to pass. Doctors in the military. My younger brother is a doctor in the military, and you recently completed a combat tour of half a year. And, I look at him and his friends, again, very talented people. There is demand for doctors all over the world, people who are willing to risk their life to save others in their military service. Would they be willing to do the same in a non-democratic country? This is a big question. And so the defense minister came out and said, we have to rethink this. Netanyahu announced he's firing him. 500,000 people went to the streets overnight. The next morning, Netanyahu did what the defense minister asked him to do, put the legislation on a 1 month delay, and basically also put his decision to fire the guy on hold, and he's still in office now. He was never actually fired. But a month has passed. And I will say during that month, the demonstrations continued every Saturday. And even when we celebrated our Independence Day this week, Israel's 75th Independence Day, at the same time that there was the official ceremony in Jerusalem where Netanyahu gave a speech and people lighted torches and stuff like that, there was a counter celebration. It wasn't branded as a demonstration, but that's what it was. It was, in fact, at the site in Tel Aviv, where you have every week the demonstrations on Kaplan Street, and you had tens of thousands of people attend that event, the alternative Independence Day ceremony, where they read on the stage the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which puts an emphasis on equality for minorities and respecting people's rights, no matter their religion or race. So that was a very important demonstration as well, I think. And now I think comes the big test, because that month of a delay is over. There is, as I said, pressure on Netanyahu to renew the legislation from within his own government, from within his own camp. This is the counter demonstration that they organized today in Jerusalem. And I think it's an important event, that counter demonstration. It's the first time that the other side, after I think a very frustrating sense that they've seen these massive demonstrations against the judicial legislation, is coming out to pressure Netanyahu. They're telling him, you promised us to do this, now do it. And this will cause a major test for the protest movement. Can it regroup and reach the same energies and numbers that existed a month ago? Because during this break period, there were some impressive demonstrations in Tel Aviv. One of them had 150,000 people, and another had 100,000 people. But the question is, can you get again to that energy on the night a month ago that Netanyahu threw out the defense minister, where 500,000 people went to the streets and basically signaled to him, don't go there. And that's a very interesting question. We'll know the answer in the coming days, obviously.
So, we've seen sometimes in images of the American flag in some of the demonstrations. Can you talk a little bit about Joe Biden's role, what he's done, what you hope he will continue to do, what you think will happen here with our foreign policy? I don't know that everyone here knows exactly the role that Joe Biden's played over the last few weeks, and I think they'd be of interest to everybody.
Yeah. So when this all started, I think it took some time for the Biden administration to understand what was happening here. And I don't blame them. They are very busy. They've got a whole set of issues that they have to deal with internally in the US, and also on the foreign policy front. There's China, there's Ukraine, there are attempts to build alliances against Russia and China, global warming. I mean, the set of challenges this administration is facing is incredible. And I think it took them some time to get this on their radar. I remember when it all started, and Secretary of State Blinken came to Israel, and he stood next to Netanyahu, and he said something about the importance of democracy and the shared values between Israel and the United States. And it was a first hint that America is watching, that the administration was paying attention to this. It took a few weeks, and I think the demonstrations played an important role in that, in getting people aware of it, because there was very intense coverage of it in the American media when you saw these huge crowds in Tel Aviv. And like you said, Simon, people, I think, strategically decided to bring signs in English and go and protest in front of the American embassy in Tel Aviv, or the former embassy. Trump moved to Jerusalem, but most of the embassy staff is still in Tel Aviv. Go and demonstrate there and show the appreciation for Biden's pro-democracy agenda and the expectation that it will reach the shores of Israel. Because for a president who has put such a great emphasis of his presidency on the protection of democracy in the United States and abroad, right? When we're talking about what happened in the midterm elections, where he said, against the advice, I think, of some of the very smart people around him, that he's going to put an emphasis on the issue of protecting democracy. And that, not that I'm, everything is important. Gas prices are important, and other issues are important. But he said the most important thing is, first of all, to keep a functioning democracy. And also when you see what he's done in Ukraine, and I think the masterful way that his administration has handled the threat to Europe and to Ukraine, and strengthened the democratic forces over there. So the idea that under his watch, a close ally like Israel will suddenly join the ranks of the half democracies, former democracies like Turkey and Hungary, I think would have been bad for his legacy, and would have been, in a way, opposed to this main theme of his presidency. And I think once he realized that, you could really see how he became more and more active on this, sending clear messages to Netanyahu that this would be harmful to the US-Israel relationship. It would harm one of the most important components of the relationship, which is the shared values, right? When we talk about the US and Israel, I like to say Israel is a VIP country in the United States. What does it mean, VIP? There's values, there is interests, and there is politics, okay? So politics, we know there are some very powerful and influential organizations that support Israel. And interests, I think it will take time to examine how much the interests of Israel and America still align. That's always under examination, and there are things that change all the time. But the values component is very important, and actually there's no reason why it would ever be under threat, supposedly. But suddenly when an Israeli government, which is to begin with much more extreme, and also on the Palestinian issue taking more problematic stances than in the past, also presents legislation that threatens Israel's very definition as a democratic country, suddenly the shared values have a question mark around them. And I think Biden communicated that very clearly to Netanyahu. He also came out and said basically that as long as this issue is not resolved, he is not going to invite Netanyahu to the White House, which for an Israeli prime minister is problematic. I mean, America is our most important ally, the only country in the world that really has skin in the game when it comes to support for Israel. We have other friends, the UK and France and Germany and other countries, but the US helps Israel annually with billions of dollars of security aid, and we like to coordinate our defense stances on issues like Iran and terror threats. And there are a lot of delicate issues that at the end of the day require a one-on-one meeting between a president and a prime minister, with all due respect to whatever can be achieved over the phone and in other meetings. And it's also a symbolic issue for an Israeli prime minister. 4 months into his term, not even an invitation to go to Washington, it sends a message. And to me, one of the most interesting questions is what the Democratic Party will do if Biden sticks to this line, that Netanyahu has to either significantly moderate this legislation, not cosmetics, but real, changes in what he wants to promote, and perhaps reach some kind of a compromise with the opposition, or he will remain in a problematic spot for the administration. Will he have the backing of the Democratic Party for this kind of approach, President Biden? Will the Democrats stand behind the president on this? And say that this is not coming from a place of being anti-Israel. The opposite, it's coming from a place of support for the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are fighting here for democracy.
Well, I think one of the most interesting developments in that front this week is the president's announcement video on Tuesday, yes, where, we didn't. By the way, my dog, I have a English bulldog who's about to announce his presence with us today. You may hear him in a second.
He wants to get educated about the situation in Israel. He's a smart dog.
He's an English bulldog. He's part of the team, and so the video that the president released, we didn't know how the president was going to announce and frame his campaign and set up the fundamental contrast that they want to set up with the Republicans. And this week, as we've talked about it, is that the president made it clear that defending democracy is now the organizing principle of his campaign and of his second term. We have to finish the job, he said.
Yes.
And so it's interesting, to your point, about how now we, as Joe Biden followers, as Democrats, we've now been given our marching orders, in essence, right? We've been told that this election is going to be about this battle for the soul of the nation, the battle for democracy versus autocracy, for freedom, as he talked about. And so I think if I were Bibi Netanyahu, I would be reading that he has now made his commitment to this broader concept even far more deeper with the public, because in the State of the Union, for example, he talked about these issues, but they were on the margins. He had other things he wanted to do in that speech. And so I think it's changed. My advice to the people of Israel is that there can't be any question now about where Joe Biden stands on these things, and about whether or not this was just rhetoric that he was doing to sort of throw it out there. He's committed his entire re-election and second term now to this. And I think it would be wise for Bibi and his allies to recognize that, Biden's commitment to challenge where the direction Bibi's going is probably deeper today than it was even a week ago. I can't speak for Joe Biden or the administration, but that would be my sense from having, being here as a domestic political guy. Yeah. He really put it on the line for the country. And And he also, by the way, said a very interesting thing, and I don't know if it was in the ad that they did, the second ad or the original video, but he talked about how the commitment to democracy is so integral to being a Democrat. And
Yep.
that was very evocative. I thought that was very powerful. It's something I talk about in a presentation I do with Democrats Things Get Better here at Hopium. But he reminded Democrats that, we were the party that have been, when we were, when the nation needed us to go fight for democracy, to preserve democracy, that the Democrats and freedom, that the Democratic Party was always there. I think that's going to be a very powerful new story he's talking to the Democratic Party, particularly a party that has a large number of very young people in it who don't have as much history on many of these issues as those of us who are no longer young. And so I think it's I was deeply encouraged and excited, frankly, the way the president came out this week. It was bold, it was ambitious, it was aggressive. He's not playing it safe. And I think it's important because you can't succeed in politics if you play it safe. And he's, I think for any of us wondering whether he was going to bring it in this election because of his age, I think he answered that question this week. So, that's my reflection to you as you, talk to your colleagues in Israel, is that this was a major event. And I hope Bibi was paying attention because it was very, what was interesting about the way he did it, right, is he tied it back to the reason he got into the election, ran in the first place. It was very personal, right? This didn't feel political. It felt deeply personal in the way that it was communicated. And so it's, this is a big moment in the evolution of this conversation, I think.
To me, it actually reminded me also of how he framed his decision to run last time around Charlottesville, which obviously, I'm an Israeli, not an American Jew, but I lived in the US. I was on assignment with Haaretz as the Washington correspondent for 3 years when Charlottesville happened and when Pittsburgh happened, the massacre of the Tree of Life, and this sense of anti-Semitism and far-right violence on the rise. And so when Biden came in and said that the moment he decided he has to run for president was after Charlottesville, after people were marching in the streets and saying Jews will not replace us, was an important moment. And I think what he did this week is in a way a continuation of that argument, that he sees his role as protecting the United States from that very particular threat of the far right and of hatred against others, which anti-Semitism is always a part of. And I think regarding your comment about will this message be received in Israel, I'm sure Netanyahu and Ron Dermer, his close advisor, perfectly understand this. The problem for them is that they are governing in a coalition with very extreme people, some of whom have a very narrow understanding of the world, don't have good English, don't follow politics in other countries that well, are not immersed in the conversation and the nuances in the United States. I mean, think about the finance minister of this government, Bezalel Smotrich, who's a far-right extremist. A few days before he was supposed to come to the US for his first visit as a minister in the government, and he was hoping to meet people in the Jewish community and maybe even the Biden administration, he, in a televised interview, called to burn down a Palestinian village that where a terrorist had committed a terror attack a day before and killed 2 Israelis. And we were all mourning the deaths of these 2 young Israeli citizens, brothers. It was a terrible tragedy. And when this happens, I can tell you as well, my blood boils and I feel, anger. But you don't go on live television and call to burn down a village. I mean, this is not as a human being, and certainly not as an elected official, a high-ranking person in the government. And especially not a few days before you are supposed to go to the United States and you want to meet people in Congress and in the administration. And of course, he came and nobody met him. I mean, nobody in the Biden administration, nobody in Congress, barely anyone in the Jewish community. It was so embarrassing. He basically tweeted a picture of himself meeting the Israeli ambassador to Washington at the embassy, as if that's like a diplomatic meeting. So this gives you a sense of the kind of people in this government that Netanyahu has aligned himself with. They don't understand the nuance and the depths of these issues in American politics. And so I am concerned whether the message will be received. But I do think, again, that it's a bit like, a hammer that if you hit just once, maybe the nail doesn't go in, but if there are more and more hits, eventually it will resonate. And I think this is why it's important not just for President Biden to speak up, but also for members of Congress in the Democratic Party and senators, and especially those who are supportive of Israel. Because in Israel, if people from the squad or, come and say something about it, it's not going to register in any way. But when you had people from, mainstream of the Democratic Party who, like Joe Biden, are known to be supporters of Israel, and Joe Biden is really someone who has been a great supporter of Israel throughout his career, and I think has met every Israeli prime minister since the 1970s. There is no living politician in Israel who can say that. Obviously for an international figure, that's impressive. But when people from the Joe Biden, if you call it a wing of the Democratic Party, come out and speak about this as supporters of Israel, it does make a difference, and it does register in the conversation here in the country.
Last question, Amir, what's going to happen?
It's always difficult to predict, but I will say, if the protests against this legislation continue and grow, and if there is still this sustained opposition also from Israel's friends in the world, including the United States, I find it hard to see Netanyahu going for it, despite the counter pressure that he's feeling right now. If the protests will wane down, and we will not see also the same determination from Washington, if Biden will be left alone on this issue, maybe Netanyahu will feel confident enough to do it. So it really depends on what will happen here in the streets in Tel Aviv, and over there, Simon, in the hallways of Congress, if you will, and the White House. This is what will determine the result. And so as an Israeli who opposes this legislation, I can say I'm optimistic, because I feel the people of Israel have a say here and have the ability to impact it. But it also depends on what we do, and also how well we communicate the urgency of this to our friends in the world.
Well, I'll say, just to close out, that I've been very moved by what I've seen, and as somebody who's worked, my whole career in politics, to see the amount of people who've poured out into the streets, the frequency, the repetition, it's extraordinary, right? And it's been very inspiring to me. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on today, Amir, is that I think it's important for those of us who are fighting for freedom and democracy here in the United States to feel kinship with Israel and with the people of Israel in your battle, and to understand that this struggle that we're in here is a global struggle, and that we have allies and friends, and that we're all in this together. And we need that consciousness, because as somebody who does a lot of talks with the equivalent of our protests and our rallies are the money we're raising, the phone calls we're making, the texts we're doing, the postcards we're writing into places like Wisconsin and in Jacksonville, Florida. I mean, we have an ongoing, never-ending civil protest that's happening, just in a different way, right? Not in the public square. And as somebody who spends time with a lot of folks who are leaders of this, I think we've gotten a lift and a boost from the people of Israel over the last few weeks, and in a sense that, hey, if they can do it, we can do it here too, right? It's been inspiring to all of us. And so I hope I can give that message to you as well back.
Thank you
for your terrific presentation today, so thoughtful and informative, that we feel solidarity and brotherhood and sisterhood with what you're doing. And I will certainly do my part to continue to help us be louder as Democrats about this. I've got some calls now that I'll make, Amir, to push a few people to be a little bit more vocal in the coming days. I'm actually having some meetings with some people in the administration over the next few days, and I'll raise this. And but anyway, thank you, and good luck. And maybe we can have you check back in a few weeks, as this moves forward. And just know that you've got a lot of allies and friends here who are rooting for you. And we need to be, as my community is aware, I talk about this concept of getting loud and being louder, and to not let the right wing here in the United States push us around in the daily information discourse that we have. we need to be louder about this. And I've tried on my Hopium site, I've been reporting on what's happening in Israel. I think the images have been very powerful. And one of the things I love about Substack is that the images on Substack
Yes.
are it's very advanced in the way you can present video and audio. And I feel like we've been able to really connect with you in that regard as well. So thank you for taking the time. I know it's late there tonight.
And thank you for hosting, and to everyone who joined and is watching now or watching later. I really appreciate that you are taking the time to learn about what's happening here and give thought to it. I think this will continue to be an important story in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, my friend, good luck. And maybe we'll have you back in a few weeks. And
all right.
Hopefully we won't have to have you back, just be resolved in a very positive way, and we can all go on with our lives. I have a feeling though that this is not going to be a neat and clean.
Well, we can pray for that and meet later to talk about what will happen. So thank you so much, Simon.
Okay.